Welcome to the final part of Lecture 3, where we're going to examine the last step of the CFD workflow, which is that of result analysis and simulation validation. In terms of result analysis, we're going to see that Fluent, or any other simulation tool such as OpenFOAM or COMSOL, is capable of generating a very large amount of data from the converged solution. Now, these data can be in the form of what I'm going to term native variables, simulation variables that have actually been used during the calculation, for example, x or y direction velocity or temperature, or derived variables, which are parameters that are calculated from the native variables, such as perhaps shear rate or heat flux. Now, an important skill as an engineer is to be able to extract the data that you need to solve the problem that you're trying to solve. And don't forget that this needs to be done in a clear and unambiguous manner, because you need to communicate this solution to your colleagues. With regard to validation, your mantra for this course should be validate, validate, validate. It is such an important part of the CFD workflow. We've already said that your default position should be not to trust what your simulation generates as an answer immediately, but that you should convince yourself of its correctness or otherwise. And this really frames the validation process very, very nicely. I'm going to introduce a 6-step framework for you, which is recommended by NASA for CFD validation, and we're going to go through this 6-step process in a little bit of detail such that you can see how to apply it to the problems that you're going to be solving, such that you can satisfy yourself of their correctness. So, let's think about how we visualize data that has been generated by a simulation first of all. This whole thing about result analysis. We're going to be using the tool within Fluent for result analysis. There are other tools within the ANSYS suite, for example CFD Post, and that is again a very capable tool, but we're going to limit our discussion here and also within the tutorials to the tool within Fluent. Now, you need to be able to exercise judgment as to what data to extract, such that you can appropriately validate your simulation and also try and answer the problem that you're trying to solve. So let's go through a few examples about how to extract data first of all, and then we'll talk more generally about the validation process. So on the whiteboard in front of you is an image of the injection head that forms part of tutorial 2. I've highlighted one of the inlet boundaries and the 6 outlet boundaries, and let's say I've run this simulation with unequal inlet velocities. So I have an imbalance between the inlet velocity at the top inlet, which is 1 centimetre per second, and at the bottom inlet, which is 5 centimetres per second. Now, suppose we wish to visualise what's going on in terms of flow structure. We could ask Fluent to release streamlines from these inlet surfaces and to colour these streamlines in terms of velocity magnitude. On the whiteboard, the lower image is exactly that, and we can see that if viewed from the right angle, this can be quite a powerful visualization. One can see where the flow is going, and by looking at the colour, one can see how fast the flow is going. Now, the problem is, however, is that if viewed from the wrong angle, it can be quite confusing. Or if you've got more complex flow structure than what's presented here, it can be almost impenetrable and can be very hard to communicate what it is you're trying to show. You can, however, use streamline plots in a more selective manner. The image I've put on the whiteboard now is a streamline plot where I've defined a line and said just release streamlines from this line. And you can see far more clearly now where those streamlines go. You can do the same with just a single point. Now, when we've got streamlines plotted, what we can do is generate data on those streamlines. So the graph that I'm showing you here would be for those few streamlines released from a line, and then what I've asked Fluent to do is to say plot velocity magnitude along the course of a streamline. So in effect, we can run with the flow and see how the velocity changes in that flow as you go from inlet through to outlet. We can export these data into whatever spreadsheet or other data processing package you wish to use. But again, we can see that the picture can be quite confusing unless good presentation is applied. And so I'd encourage you, when you think about extracting and analysing data, to do so in a mindful manner, and to only plot those data that you actually need to plot to articulate the point that you're trying to get across. Now, these data here are for velocity magnitudes. That is a native variable. We can't, however, use any derived variable or even give Fluent user specifications of derived variables that it doesn't have as a default. And so, for example, this plot now shows, for that same set of streamlines, what your strain rate or shear rate is going to be, again plotted along each streamline. And so the tools you have natively within Fluent are very powerful to allow you to do this. But again, as you can see from the slightly confusing nature of this plot, they should be used with care, and you should put your own analysis skills into play to try and make sure that these data are understandable and presented in a manner that allows that understanding to be gained. Let's talk about the most important step, validation. Remember your mantra: validate, validate, validate. So validation is a process that is carried out to see whether simulation and reality are sufficiently similar to solve whatever problem it is you're trying to solve. Now, on Moodle, I have put a copy of a 63-page paper on this subject. That's how important it is. It's by Oberkampf and Tricano. And I'm not recommending that you read all of this, but if you want any more detail about the steps that I'm talking about here, that would be a good reference to turn to. As I outlined in the introduction, I'm going to show you a 6-step process that's been recommended by NASA, and there's the web link to that 6-step process. And it consists thus. Firstly, examine your iterative convergence. Secondly, examine what we're going to term consistency, which is in fact a flux balance. Thirdly, examine your spatial convergence, otherwise known as a mesh refinement study. Fourth, if you're doing a non-steady state, time-based simulation, look at your temporal convergence. Have you actually got to your end time in that time-dependent simulation? We can skip step 4 if you're doing a steady state simulation. Step 5, look at your results and compare them to some experimental data. And we're going to talk a lot more about that. And finally, examine what are termed model uncertainties. I'll define what I mean by that in a second. So what I'd like to do now is go through each of these 6 steps and talk about them in a little bit more detail. So, first step, examine iterative convergence. What this is saying is, has your simulation tolerances been reached? Remember that we said in Fluent we can specify a given number of iterations, and that the solver will stop running either when that given number of iterations has been reached or when convergence has been attained. And so there on the whiteboard in front of you is a reminder of the message that you will see in the Fluent log when you get your convergence tolerances met. You should see that message: solution is converged. More generally though, when we're thinking about iterative convergence, you should ask yourself the question, what is the effect of that convergence tolerance? The default setting is 10 to the minus 3 for velocities. It's 10 to the minus 5 or thereabouts for thermal parameters. Is that important? Does that affect the nature of the answer? Try reconverging at, say, 10 to the minus 5 tolerance for velocities and see if there's any discernible difference between the two sets of results. Converging to 10 to the minus 5 might take a lot longer. In some cases, that tolerance may not even be reached. But if it is reached, compare 10 to the minus 5 and 10 to the minus 3. And if there's no significant difference, say within a few percent, then use 10 to the minus 3 because it's quicker to run, and you know at that point that it is generating sufficiently accurate data. Step 2. Consistency. Is mass conserved in your flow problem? Is energy conserved in your thermal problem? And so what we're talking about here is a mass balance and an energy balance. There are tools within Fluent that allow you to do this, typically the surface integral tool. On the screen in front of you, I've illustrated how you would do such a mass balance using the surface integral tool. And you can see that the log that it gives tells you both the mass flux in the inlets, the mass flux out of the set of outlets, and what the difference between those two is. Now, the order of magnitude here is small for all of these numbers, but if you look at the inlets, they're of order 10 to the minus 6 or 10 to the minus 7. If you look at the outlets, they're around 10 to the minus 6. If you look at the difference, it's 10 to the minus 13. And so we can see that in this case, yes, mass has been conserved, since there's roughly 6 or 7 orders of magnitude difference between what our flow rates are and what the mass balance error is. And so the surface integral tool can be a very, very useful check on the simulation consistency. And you can do this as well with energy balances. Third point, spatial convergence. Now this is the part of the validation that may take you a little bit of time. The graph that I've put on the screen here is a plot of a simulation output. In this particular case, let's say it's a calculated power coefficient, a very good example of a derived variable, as a function of the mesh density, plotted as the number of mesh elements. So the red line there shows that the power coefficient starts to asymptote with increasingly more refined meshes, with larger numbers of mesh elements. The blue line, however, shows you very clearly that as you use larger and larger meshes, your simulation time starts to increase very significantly. And so, remember what we said when we talked about meshing. Your mesh is where your transport equations are solved. Your mesh therefore has to be sufficiently fine enough to give you reasonably good solutions to those transport equations. A coarse mesh will give you very rough solutions. A very fine mesh will give you increasingly more accurate solutions. As we will see in the second part of this course, mesh means memory. And so the more mesh you have, the longer the solution will take. And there will come a point where the mesh size that you might wish to calculate is just simply too large for the amount of physical memory that your computer system has. So, when you do a mesh refinement study, there is going to be a natural upper bound, that of the system memory within your computer. But what you should do is increase your mesh resolution as far as pragmatically possible and see how that affects certain parts of your answer. It might be a pressure drop, for example, in a duct. It might be a velocity at a given critical point. It might be, for example, the length of a recirculation zone. If you imagine that backwards facing step problem where you have that recirculating vortex, it might be that length of the vortex. There will come a point where whichever parameter you've chosen will start to asymptote and flatten off and become largely independent of the mesh that you are using. These simulations, however, will usually take quite a long time. And so what you have to do as an engineer is find a compromise. You have to find a mesh that is good enough for the purposes of your solution. It's going to be a compromise of accuracy versus computational cost. So those very refined mesh simulations might sometimes take days to complete. However, if you're doing parameter sensitivity studies, you don't want to wait days for each solution if you can possibly avoid it. And so you need to be able to choose a mesh, say, that will give you something within 5% of the answer that you'd get with a very fine mesh, but maybe with 1/10 of the computational time. Once you know what those errors are, if there's a particular solution you want to explore in more depth, you might run that as a special case on a refined mesh. So step 3 of this validation workflow really underpins the importance of your mesh and of the interconnected nature of your answer that you get with the mesh upon which it is calculated. You need to understand that interconnection, and you need to see when your answers get increasingly independent of your mesh. Step 4 is temporal convergence. For time-dependent simulations, do you reach the end time? We're not talking in any detail on this course about time-dependent simulations, so we're just going to skip that step for the time being and go straight to step 5, which is comparison against experimental data. This really is the nub of it. Does your mathematical model bear any resemblance to physical reality? So, experimental data for the means of this course can also mean literature data or a comparison against some sort of approximate hand calculation. What you're trying to do is to assess whether the answer that your computer is generating is sensible. We talk about this a lot in the tutorials that you'll go through. In one of your tutorials, you will have effectively an analytical method to calculate a pressure drop, and hopefully what you'll see is that there is incredibly good agreement between that analytical method and what your CFD simulation should calculate. So never underestimate the power of a simple hand calculation as a contribution towards validation. If we were looking at real experimental data, what you would need to do is to plan a very careful campaign of experiments where you take a series of building blocks. Each building block is an increase in complexity such that you start to understand the full nature of the problem. You want to make sure, first of all, that your simulation can capture the really simple things. If it can't capture the really simple things, it's not going to be able to capture the really complex things. Now, this building block approach looks a little bit like this. Firstly, you start with what's termed a unit problem. It's going to be a simple geometry where you've got maybe one element of flow physics, one relevant flow feature, perhaps a single vortex, remember that backwards facing step in 2D, and where you know precisely what's going on with your boundary conditions. Specified inlet velocity, specified outlet pressure, no slip boundary conditions on your stationary walls. You can then look at the evolution of that vortex structure experimentally, and then you can compare it to simulation. And with something that simple, you should be able to get excellent correspondence. The next step is to go to something called a benchmark case. You've still got a relatively simple geometry, but you might now have two coupled flow features. You might have two vortices where one depends on the other. There may also be a slight uncertainty about the exact nature of your boundary condition. You might not have perfect control over, for example, a far field boundary condition. You might also have an increasingly large data set. So again, choosing which data you extract from your experiments, understanding the error analysis associated with that, and then comparing it to your model is going to be a crucial part of this step. The next case is what is termed a subsystem case, where we have a relatively complex geometry. And it might be, for example, a part of an aeroplane wing. It might be a tip part, it might be an engine cowling. It's a relatively complex geometry compared to your benchmark case, but we're still trying to simplify the overall problem to try and reduce the coupling of the various bits of flow physics that are there. These will probably be quite long-winded experiments, and they may be quite hard to get good quality data. That data that you get, again, should be compared to your simulation, but we know now that we may have more uncertainty between those two cases. And so when we compare, we have to say, well, is the mismatch here due to experimental error, or is it due to a problem within the CFD? And that becomes a matter of quite in-depth analysis. Finally, you might have your complete system you're modelling, for example, an entire aeroplane, not just a wing of an aeroplane. You're going to have all your flow physics, you're going to have probably very complex simulations taking maybe up to a week to run. How you extract experimental data and how you capture experimental data is also going to be a matter of a great deal of technique and possibly a great deal of complexity. There may well be a large amount of uncertainty involved in your experimental data now. So this becomes quite an art, getting the experimental data, analysing your experimental data, understanding your experimental data, obtaining your flow simulation, extracting the relevant data from that, comparing the two together, and making a judgment call as to whether experiment and simulation, with the errors now inherent in both, are sufficiently fit for purpose. If yes, then that's great. You have a validated simulation that you can then go on to use for other means. Final part of the process, model uncertainties. We took as our context for step 5 an aeroplane. We're no longer in the laminar flow regime. So when you move to turbulent flow, you will find that the flow phenomena are just so complex, we have to make simpler models of what's going on. You'll come across, and we will talk about later, various turbulence models and the problem of closure. We'll talk about K epsilon or K omega. These are simplified models of the phenomenon of turbulence, which themselves will have error associated with. Each of these models will have various parameters that you can set. And so at this point, you need to understand the sensitivity between an adjustment of a parameter and a result in your CFD. And so another way of phrasing step 6 model uncertainties is a sensitivity analysis. This can also apply for laminar flow cases. If you've got uncertainty, say, in a heat transfer situation, what happens if you change your thermal conductivity by a multiple of 2, or a multiple of 5, or a multiple of a fifth? Does it affect your solution or does it not? This might be important if you have a coupling between your viscosity and your temperature. Typically, fluids become less viscous with increasing temperature. And so if there's uncertainty around a material property, do a sensitivity analysis on that to see how it affects your results. It may not affect your results at all, in which case you can prove that your simulation is insensitive to that, or it may have an effect far beyond what you could have ever imagined, which asks you, or may pose, some very, very pertinent questions about how you proceed. So, I'd like to recap a few key points. In terms of result analysis, extract data from your simulations with care. Give enough to demonstrate to someone else the solution to your problem, but not so much that the message gets lost. It's very easy to generate data overload with results from numerical simulation. Validate, validate, validate is the mantra of this course, and that is something I want to remind you of yet again. And in order to do that, we've introduced a 6-step validation process. Your tutorials will step you through the various parts of this such that you can become more intimately familiar with applying this process. But remember that this process consists of firstly a check on your iterations. Have you had a sufficient number of iterations, and are your convergence tolerances fit for purpose? Does your mass balance and does your energy balance? Is your simulation consistent? How does your simulation result depend on the refinement of your mesh, spatial convergence? Is your simulation time dependent? Has it run for long enough? Has it reached its end time, temporal convergence? Does the simulation bear any reality to experimental data? For the purposes of this course, we're going to be looking at use of analytical models and data from literature. If, however, you were doing a CFD campaign for a project, you may well have a parallel experimental program to give validation data. And when we talked about that experimental program, don't forget that you start simple and then build up to increasing complexity. The first experiment you should do should be incredibly well controlled, such that there is very little uncertainty in the experimental data. The final step of the CFD validation process is to investigate the effect of your modelled physics. What happens if you change the parameters in your turbulence model by a given percentage increase or percentage decrease? So in effect it's a sensitivity study. If you can satisfy yourself that all these 6 steps have been successfully completed, then you can start to trust what your model is generating.